Alberta, traditionally known for its beautiful landscape, prairie, just-do-it spirit, and economically its vast energy resources, is rapidly emerging as a global tech hub. Now, with innovators and entrepreneurs leading digital transformations not just within the province but across the globe, Alberta is making waves in the tech world. In fact, between 2021 and 2023, Alberta's spending on digital transformation is forecasted to surpass a whopping $20 billion, which really indicates a robust year-over-year continued growth. But the question is Alberta the next Silicon Valley of the North? Welcome to This Professional Life podcast, a series about business development, the professionals that work behind the scenes, and business stories to spark conversations. Hi, I'm Chris, and welcome to the podcast. Alberta is a province in Canada that is known for its entrepreneurial spirit and go-get-'em attitude when it comes to business. In 1947, a major oil reserve was discovered near Leduc, a small town just outside the province's capital of Edmonton. Leduc number 1 is what most of us in Alberta refers to, as the rig was the first to discover these reserves. Now, ever since then, Alberta has been the North America hub for all things energy. But with the changing public perception of the oil and gas industry, combined with significant competition coming from lower cost sources like in the Middle East, Alberta has had to reimagine its footprint on the world economic scene, which is why the province's tech sector is not just growing, it's maturing. For 5 consecutive years, Alberta has broken records in venture capital investments, notably 4 Calgary-based tech giants, including Benevity and Solium Capital, which has achieved the coveted unicorn status, showcasing the province's potential to produce billion-dollar tech companies. But what's really driving this tech renaissance? And can Alberta reposition itself as Silicon Valley of the North? Joining me on today's podcast is Michael Grantmyre, partner and lawyer at Oslers, a national law firm in Canada. Michael's role at Oslers is focused on the emerging growth and technology sectors in Alberta. I wanted to have a conversation with him as his legal practice often puts him right at the forefront of all things happening in the technology sector.
I would kind of describe my practice as a bit of a life cycle practice where, I get involved from the earliest possible stages, even pre-incorporation, oftentimes with founders, working through, what the business and structure will look like, through to the latest possible stages, going through, subsequent rounds of financing to an M&A event and, the lead up to IPOs where companies tend to go that direction. But I kind of joke that I'm, in addition to being a lawyer, I'm also kind of the friend, the therapist, and the business advisor. And, particularly founders going through their sometimes tumultuous journey, requires, I think, a partner on the legal side in the space to think a little bit more outside of the box and not so narrowly focused just on what the legal product delivery is on a daily basis and kind of, doing the hard work to find out how you can add value around the fringes too. So anyways, a bit about me.
Yeah, no, and I've got a lot of questions just from that. And I know we have some other questions I want to get into for the Alberta tech scene, but you brought up a couple of good things. And I think the first one that we'll get to later is about foreign buyers. I got some questions about foreign buyers and kind of the acquisition activity that's happening. But maybe let's start at the ground level with these founders. You mentioned, being the therapist or the sounding board for a lot of these entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship can be quite lonely, and it's not any way straightforward, especially in the startup world. Talk to me a little bit. You talked about like helping founders structure their business. What are some of the difficulties and challenges that you've helped your clients get through when it comes to that initial stage? Because, sometimes, when you have a limited budget and you're just looking to get up and running, you often don't think about a lot of the legal things, the accounting things that, may plague your company down the road. So like, what are some of the challenges you do find working with founders?
Yeah, I think, you hit on a really important one, which is, oftentimes your average early stage founder kind of has a somewhat reasonable, frankly, fear of involving legal, particularly when you see, a large kind of national firm, looking to support you. I think that the problem in that thinking, though, is that you can sometimes structure things when you just kind of go it on your own, pull documents off the internet, you use the kind of family friend who isn't familiar with what it's like to practice in the tech and venture space to kind of backfill a little bit. You sometimes find that that approach can create more issues than it actually solves. And the kind of insidious thing about this is that those issues are not often, front and center in the early days,
Right.
because, hey, what does it matter? We've got this business going. We've got a company incorporated. Who cares that, my partner has no vesting arrangements? And we went into this thinking that, they may only be short term on this anyways. And, they weren't really sure whether they would be doing this on the long run or not. And that becomes an issue when that partner has now left the business with half the company and is no longer providing value on a go forward basis. So there are a lot of things that, can get missed when you kind of don't start off with the right advice. And I'm careful about offering that feedback because I never want this to feel like a self-promotion commercial, because it's
For sure.
it is very convenient for me to say, yes, use Michael at Osler to help you with your legal work in the early days. But the reality is, whether it's me or someone else, I think the important part is really just getting someone who's able to set you up for success from day one. And there's sometimes a bit of soul searching involved with founders and companies, thinking about, where is this business actually going? And, your legal advisors as an early stage company should be realistic about how you should be supported in light of that. So if this is kind of, a lifestyle business and it's a startup, but, just kind of something that you're slowly grinding away at and don't expect to grow significantly, that's kind of a different proposition than something that is, expected to grow at hyperspeed, will entail a lot of investment from investors, create a lot of value over a short period of time. And so there are different ways to think about setting those companies up. So I would say that the biggest issue sometimes that I run into is that, someone has kind of, with a view to deferring what they expect will be a lot of cost to engage a lawyer, from whatever firm it is to support, that they've kind of just gone at their own. The reality is, Osler being as big as it is actually a benefit to founders on a variety of fronts, including from a fee sensitivity perspective. We're able to look at our relationships with clients as kind of lifelong relationships versus these kind of short-term transactional, what were our fees for this client, last week or last month or last quarter. That's really not our perspective on the client relationship. And I mean, if we have time on the podcast, we can dig into how we kind of view the economics of our practice and the billing model. But the key takeaway I would hope for founders, if they're any kind of listening to this podcast, would be, to not worry about, a firm like Osler not being a partner for you and kind of making sure you give us the opportunity to try to steer you in the right direction. I spend sometimes months just having ad hoc conversations with founders, arming them with, how they need to think about building the business and structuring considerations with, frankly, no expectation of return. And it's because I believe that you sometimes have to lead with value before, putting your hand out and asking for something, on the client side. So I'd say that's the biggest one. We see a lot of founders get into trouble, and I kind of alluded to it in my earlier remarks, but just on the vesting side, not having properly thought of vesting arrangements for the kind of key contributing shareholders, where, you've got someone who leaves the company in the early days with like a huge chunk of equity that, really does a bunch of damage to the cap table that needs to be corrected, sometimes with a lot of pain in order to raise capital. We see IP ownership issues where founders have not, again, this is not their business. Their business is building an incredible product and company and kind of bringing that to the world, obviously. So, legal, understandably, is not always the kind of founder's, biggest strong suit. And so, we see IP chain of title issues where, maybe they developed it in the context of a university stint, and a couple of years after founding the business and feeling like they've got traction, realize they don't actually own the IP, the university does, and now they don't have an investable business. Which is by no means to say that universities are out to get you, of course, but it's just some have kind of inventor-owned policies, whereas others say, the university owns it, and it's usually a conversation about the terms on which that IP ultimately gets assigned back to the company. So sometimes founders just don't know that and don't have that conversation, and that IP just sits at the university, unbeknownst to everybody. And then the other would be tax issues, sometimes not thinking about the tax implications of equity ownership, moving equity around, what issuing equity to employees and new founders in a company that's, received some early capital actually entails, and how to do that in a way that's not creating tax liability for the people that you're trying to ultimately incentivize.
I work with a lot of accountants as well, and the stories I hear sometimes where founders, I just issued 20% share of the company to this employee because he's a good friend, and they've been working here for 2 years, and the accountants they like, don't do that. Like there's ways that we need to do this properly, and
totally.
But you watch the movies, you read the articles, and it's like, employee share options or founders split 30% coming, and it seems so easy on the surface. But you're right, like without an expert there who's done it before, there's so many things that you don't know about. And sometimes you create bigger problems with the regulators than you originally had.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
I want to switch the focus a little bit now to the Alberta tech scene, because it is growing. And, what's interesting, especially with you being in Calgary, Calgary being the corporate hub for a lot of the energy sector, we're seeing a bit of a shift, and not necessarily out of the energy sector. It could be a lot of innovation and technology within the energy sector, but overall, we are starting to see a bit of a transition into tech space, and you've got government policies that want to promote that. Are there some things you can discuss on that front in terms of, some of the global companies that are coming into, whether it's Calgary or Edmonton or in Alberta in general, and maybe some of the policies that have been passed over, the last few years to really kickstart that encouragement of outside investment in the tech sector into Alberta?
There's quite a lot. I mean, we could probably spend the entire episode just talking about some of those initiatives. And I think that's really a testament to the province's commitment to, growing the tech sector here in Alberta, the federal government's commitment to that. And then, all of these other actors, which are kind of quasi-government and kind of private entities, really kind of pushing to grow the ecosystem here. I mean, I think and I come at this from a different perspective, I think, than a lot of people, or maybe most people in Alberta, only because I'm a bit of a new recruit here in the province. And so, I was with Osler in our emerging and high growth companies practice until January of last year. And so moved from Toronto to Calgary really to support the firm's efforts to continue to build its practice in the prairies, which, has been longstanding, but we're really continuing to double down. So I have a bit of a different perspective perhaps than some people who have kind of grown up here in Calgary. But I mean, my observation in terms of and I wouldn't say it's by any means a transition away from energy to tech, but rather just like a diversification of the economy. And I think I think there's actually this really interesting kind of symbiotic relationship between energy, the energy sector and the technology sector, which has also helped grow the tech space here. And I think, you've got, the energy sector is like a huge consumer of technology and a huge developer of technology as well. Oil and gas companies are, to their credit, doing quite a bit in the energy transition space. And then you've got this huge wealth of talent that comes out of that space as well, that's been really kind of focusing on tech too. So I think, that combined with COVID and really showing us that you can build an incredible company anywhere. We're no longer just solely focused in kind of the large, well-known technology sectors, both within Canada and, the rest of the world, but you can be remote and get your work done and, still build something incredible regardless of where you're at. I think that combined with a lot of some of the policies, transitioning into that point of your question that we've seen, over the last few years has really made a huge impact. And so, when I think about programs and organizations supporting the technology space in Alberta, contributing to this explosive growth that we've been seeing over the last, number of years now, you can look at things like, Elevate IP is a great example. So, provincial programs sponsored by the federal government, thanks to with a huge shout out to Innovate Calgary and the University of Calgary, which has just been like a tireless advocate of the tech space in so many ways. They applied for this program, were successful in getting it, and essentially received a $10 million grant to deploy to basically support the development and growth of IP in Alberta. And their mission is again, to their credit, quite broad on the IP front. So they're looking at supporting IP strategy. So helping companies think about, what is the path to commercialization of this particular IP? So more than just like, hey, how do we, how do we protect it? It's kind of like, how do we actually develop this IP in a way that's, that we can commercialize it and make a business out of this. So they're funding support of that. And the support of that could be, strategic advisors, giving the company and the founders input on how to actually do that. People who have kind of been there and done this before. Elevate IP is also funding the actual nuts and bolts of IP commercialization and development. So, if you need help paying for the cost of filing a patent, Elevate IP is there to do that. If you need help paying for the costs of, your master services agreement or your SaaS agreement for your business, Elevate IP is there to help with that. And again, they're, which I love about them, they are not taking this like super rigid structure of like, it needs to fit in like this neat bucket, or this neat bucket, because there's no neat buckets in tech. It's just, organized chaos sometimes, people trying to move as quickly as they can because that's the name of the game, right? And so Elevate IP is great on that front. There are also, a bunch of non-dilutive grants, which I think is a factor that's like very unique in Alberta. Not to say there aren't government grants in other parts of the country, but thinking about my prior life in Toronto, I see so much more availability and emphasis on non-dilutive grants here in Alberta, which is, something that's unique. And then you've got, venture funds like Thin Air Labs, which have a services side that actually helps founders, because anyone that applies for grants knows that it's a skill in and of itself to figure out, what grants you're eligible for and to kind of shepherd the application through the process with the granting organization. So Thin Air Labs has a services side that one of their services is just helping founders find, non-dilutive grants that they're eligible for, helping them apply for those. So that's awesome. You've got government organizations like Alberta Enterprise Corporation. It is effectively a fund of funds, and their business, while they're involved in many things, kind of one of the most notable ones for this conversation is that they invest as LPs in venture funds, particularly those venture funds that are investing in Alberta. And so,
right.
The really interesting thing about them, they used to be investing in later stage venture funds, kind of 60 million of assets under management, and have recently started investing in kind of earlier stage fund managers with, a track record and kind of investing background and knowledge, et cetera. Obviously, like they need to be qualified, but the point is They're giving earlier stage investment funds a chance and opportunity to raise capital to kind of continue to build the early stage pipeline of kind of great companies coming up in this province. They also have an incredible role in bringing other VCs to Alberta. So Alpaca VC, which is a venture fund based in Calgary. Calgary is that fund's only non-US office. Alpaca is a New York venture fund. And again, thanks to AEC, they're also based in Alberta and, actively looking for investments in this province. So anyways, and then you've got other examples of Flying Fish, Seattle-based venture fund, generative AI and AI generally is kind of its focus. They have an office and support in Edmonton. You've got other actors like Creative Destruction Lab, cropping up. You've got, venture funds, new ones every day, it feels like, in diverse spaces, including ag tech. You look at Tall Grass Ventures, for example. You look at, Weeds up in Edmonton, and there's lots of other great examples. And then you've got these kind of community venture builders like Alta ML and Combine. And then you've got, folks like Startup TNT, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later on in this episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've got this kind of coalescing of both this real commitment for diversification that is, again, in many ways kind of symbiotic with the energy space and works so well with the energy space, with these awesome government programs. And then I think one other interesting thing in terms of like the growth of the tech space in Alberta is like you've got, at least in my observation being here, this really cool culture of help, support, and inclusion. So people here are so friendly. They're so open to having conversations about how you can work together. And not that everyone expects value to come out of every single one of those conversations, but people are at least willing to hear you out and they want to help.
Right.
Yeah. The number of times I've had a conversation with someone I just met who said, "Oh, I should introduce you to this person," is incredible. And I mean, people take a genuine interest in others here. And I'm convinced it's one of Alberta's superpowers.
Yeah, we are a close-knit community.
Yeah.
Definitely tied together that way. So on that note, so we've got lots of, you mentioned alpaca, flying fish. So we've got a lot of the venture funds in here. From your experience, is there any one segment within the tech space? So whether it's ag tech, or healthcare tech or health tech, is there anyone that is driving most of the growth, or is it fairly equal across maybe four that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we see now is really this diversification of industry focus in tech here. And I think that that's a good thing. So, most people would probably assume that energy transition is kind of, Alberta's thing and maybe ag tech. But the reality is, we have such a vibrant ecosystem from an energy transition perspective, from a ag tech perspective, from a fintech perspective. Health and digital health and life sciences is another big one. AI and generative AI is another, rapidly emerging sector, especially with, all of the AI and ML talent coming out of Edmonton through, through Amy and Alta ML. And then you've got, Google DeepMind, which, as you're, I'm sure aware, has kind of closed its doors. A lot of that kind of really super deep technical AI talent is still in Edmonton to a large extent. And I think that you've got this kind of, it still is a center of excellence from an AI perspective. And so to me, that's the thing that's so exciting, is that it's kind of like, X industry and Y industry and Z industry and like all of these other industries together that are really kind of doing incredible things. So, and you've got leaders in all of these spaces. I mean, you've got kind of, Neo obviously is the low hanging fruit to reference in the fintech space. But on the fintech side, you've also got companies like Helsum. You've also got companies, that are doing great things in the health space, like PurposeMed, for example. You've got Reach as well, and, Cement and, Adabotics in like a totally different industry.
Right.
You've got Athenian doing great things in the legal tech space. And so, there's all these great examples of kind of really category leading companies, but you've also got these really incredible up and comer companies, which are just really knocking it out of the park. And kind of look at, Mercator AI, for example, which is, in the construction space effectively. So they're like an AI tool for customer and lead generation in the construction space and creating, a platform for that. You've got, PayShepherd, which, helps a lot of the large corporates, figure out the gaps between contractor invoicing and what's actually, finally paid. And then you've got Philips, for example, which, is Alice Reimer's company, who used to be Alice was the site lead at CDL and, incredibly well-known and plugged in within the tech space. So lots of great examples of like, but very diverse examples, which is something that I'm personally very excited about.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how big AI has gotten over the last few months. But when you look at a lot of the companies, as you mentioned, like Alta ML, Amy, they're here in Edmonton that's been doing AI for a long time and machine learning that, pre-chat GPT, they were already like leaders and innovators in this space. Yeah, they're the OGs of it. It is astonishing that when you bring up some of these and you're like, oh my God, they're in Alberta.
Yeah.
That's crazy that we do have this ecosystem of companies that have just flourished. And, it's hard sometimes to see that a lot of times you don't hear about them until they hit Silicon Valley or, they do an IPO on the NASDAQ or whatever it is, right? It's almost like on a global scale, we're not quite getting that recognition yet, but hopefully that will change soon.
We need to, I think, brag a little bit more about some of our accomplishments sometimes. I think we can be pretty reserved. So,
we are that way too, right? Like we're a bit reserved about that. We're not, thumping our chests about some of these accomplishments as much as I would say the US companies often do when they do see success. But that being said, we do have a lot of homegrown organizations that are trying to get the word out, and they're definitely doing a great job. And one of them that you did mention before, Startup TNT, and I met the founders as well at one of their events last year. Can you talk a little bit about those initiatives and maybe some other programs you are seeing from a grassroots level come up to support, the tech sector here in Alberta?
For sure. Yeah. So Startup TNT is definitely, an organization that I just totally love. And I think they've done incredible work. Zach and Tim in Edmonton, Neil here in Calgary, Jesse in Saskatchewan, Gloria in Manitoba. They're just knocking it out of the park from my perspective. And what's been really just awesome to see is their growth. And, they're one of the first organizations that I really came in contact with here in Alberta. And, it was really interesting. Like they started in 2019. I got here, last year in 2022. And even at that point, the kind of main things that they were doing was just kind of and this is how the organization started out, it was, the TNT part starts for a Thursday night tradition. And so they would do drinks every Thursday evening, focused around the tech ecosystem and, founders, investors, et cetera. And that's kind of what I jumped into at the point that I arrived in Alberta last year. And it was cool. Like it was an awesome form of community, and it was, everyone was super welcoming and fun to take part of those things. But, they just in like a meteoric way continued to grow and grow and grow. And, it went from these Thursday night drinks to, starting to make some investments in companies to, now we're doing this summit where we're like broadly televising and hosting huge numbers of people, where we're, taking 20 companies down to like, 10 to 5 and one winner ultimately, with others getting side deals and other investments. So like, these really cool pitch competitions where founders would pitch for investment from Startup TNT and their investors that they worked with, to now Startup TNT having like an actual dedicated venture fund that you can be an LP in. And so it's just kind of, when you kind of specifically look at their story, it almost kind of like mirrors so much of this awesome accelerated growth that we're seeing in Alberta. And so, whenever I just think about them and what they've done, I'm always, kind of brings a smile to my face, because it is in so many ways a proxy for what I've seen in this province overall. And it's just such a great example of the trajectory of where this ecosystem is going. So like, I think if you look at their impact to date, they've invested somewhere around $9 million.
Oh, wow.
Which is, pretty incredible for a grassroots organization investing what is essentially at nearly the earliest possible stages of some of these companies. So like, not big check sizes. That's $9 million is a lot of investments made.
Yeah.
So super cool organization. The people there are doing incredible work, and they're also, aside from the investing work they're doing, they're obviously, doing a lot of educational work for new LPs coming into the fund, trying to educate founders, et cetera. but they're also incredible marketers. And, to the point we were just discussing where, sometimes we need to beat our chests a little bit more about, the successes in this province. Startup G&T is great about creating a bunch of hype around what's going on. And they're really, in doing so, putting Alberta on the map, which is great. So so Startup G&T is a great one. Other great examples of kind of the organizations that are making huge impacts in the community would be Start Alberta. They have a bunch of initiatives. The most notable is their platform for tracking, the progress of companies and kind of the telephone book, as it were, for, who's who in the industry and, what all the various companies are up to in terms of fundraising and, headcount and, readiness to raise another round. And that was, as a newcomer again to Alberta, having that tool was an incredible one to have. And
Right.
That's another example of an idea that kind of spun out of AEC and was headed up by some of the team members from AEC, and is now just like an awesome tool that gives you a snapshot of the industry at any given point. They also host their annual tech awards. So, Oslers sponsored last year, we're sponsoring again this year, and it's a good opportunity to recognize kind of category leaders, people who are influential in the community, people who are, supporting, diversity and inclusion in our ecosystem, and just kind of taking a moment to celebrate the wins. Another good one is Innovate Calgary and USeed. And I had mentioned Innovate Calgary previously, but and I won't rehash everything about them, obviously, but, key role in Elevate IP. They've got an awesome fellowship program, which, provides companies with non-dilutive funding to kind of get off the ground and start to develop a product. They've got, facilities within the university that companies use to kind of test and develop products, particularly in the health and life sciences industries. And then you got USeed, which is, I believe, one of the only fully university managed venture funds that incorporates students, that invests in a whole bunch of different spaces. And, Pete leads USeed over at the University of Calgary, and he is an incredible human being and a great advocate for the ecosystem as well. But, just awesome to see that they're investing in the early stages. And, I've had many great conversations with Pete at USeed, and, is something that's always kind of struck me and that I've kind of found to be really interesting is his view is, their role is to help catalyze investment at the earliest possible stages with angel investors. And, what an awesome mission, because that is the scariest time usually to invest in startups, where
100%.
Their outcomes are so binary in those early days. And, you've got awesome investors like USeed as a result, though, trying to kickstart their fundraising opportunities. And that's not an easy space to play in. And to their credit, they do a great job and they make a lot of investments. They're very active. So they also do a bunch of educational programs. So, through Innovate Calgary and Marion at Innovate Calgary, I was recently just speaking to corporate and governance structure considerations for early stage companies. And they do a lot of those types of things with other experts in fields that are relevant to early stage companies. And then you've got Alberta Innovates, which is another good example. So kind of this quasi-government organization. It's interesting, not being new here. I was speaking to someone from Alberta Innovates, and I said, I didn't realize that they were actually a government entity. And they said, well, that's pretty awesome, because they move quickly and conduct themselves like a private organization that, doesn't have those kind of, typical, maybe bottlenecks that you would see in, the average government entity. And I think that's all a credit, to them and to the province in terms of, how they're trying to make sure they support Alberta Innovates and how Alberta Innovates in turn supports the ecosystem. But they do a lot of great work. So, Inventures is a great example, something that Alberta Innovates puts on. They did this Inventures Invitational event that happened just before Inventures this year. And so, I was invited out to that to speak on a panel, but basically it was Alberta Innovates bringing a bunch of US venture funds up to Alberta to help them understand, the opportunity that exists to invest in this province. And there were investors from, California, from, New York, from Texas, from, Montana, from, a bunch of different states in the US, but, a good number of people, but, Alberta Innovates just kind of quietly bringing these people in to say, hey, here's why you should be here, and why, if you're not investing in Alberta, you're actually missing out. And so they do a lot of really important, great work on stuff like that. And then I think, you might have seen the announcement on August 22nd, just a few days ago, where they basically committed $13.6 million to, various organizations here in the province. So I think Alberta IoT was a benefactor of that. I think Movement 51, which is, part of 51 and focuses really on addressing, financial inequalities that affect women and, providing education, et cetera, in the tech and venture space. And I think 500 startups also got cash from them, among others, but to kind of support their angel investing program, which, again, like, what an awesome opportunity to take all these super intelligent people who have, done a lot of investing work in more traditional Alberta industries like, oil and gas, et cetera, and, giving them, access to, a new form of investing in a new industry, because it's not like, these people are incredibly intelligent, and, sometimes there's just a different set of rules that operate in venture, and it's helpful to have these types of programs that give people the kind of formative basis for them to just run with it, and start to invest in early stage companies. So, a lot of great examples. I could probably keep going on and on, but
for sure,
conscious that you probably want to ask some other questions.
Well, so you bring up a good point about when you said Alberta Innovates, they kind of bringing in some foreign investors in. Can you comment a little bit about, what trends you're seeing? Are you seeing a big uptake in foreign investment into the tech scene in Alberta? And, what are some of the areas that they are focusing on when it comes to investing into Alberta?
Yeah, for sure. So absolutely, we are seeing foreign investment in Alberta, and I kind of think about that as like investment from other parts of Canada into Alberta, as well as investment from other countries into Alberta companies. And so, can't go through necessarily all the details of some of these deals that are confidential, of course, but I mean, we're seeing lots of US investment. We're seeing lots of investment from corporate ventures out of Europe as well. And then we're seeing lots of investment from other parts of Canada coming into Alberta as well. Again, all venture fund investments. Yeah. And it's something that's increasingly more and more common. I think that there's a couple of factors there which are relevant. And I think the quality of the companies here and the founders are just top notch. There's also, and this is increasingly changing, but I think that there's historically been a bit of a valuation disconnect in Alberta for Alberta companies relative to, maybe Toronto and Vancouver companies. And so I think some investors who invest here probably see a bit of valuation arbitrage that exists where, the pricing on their deals in Alberta may be a little bit better than what they might find in other parts of the country, or certainly in the US. But it's certainly been part of like a macro trend from our perspective. And, industries that we've seen a lot of non-Alberta investors investing in would be, certainly AI, generative AI. We just did a deal recently, two large US VCs invested in that company. And we're seeing a lot of investment in fintech as well. So obviously, we've got lots of great examples of those companies here in the province. And then we're also seeing a lot of interest in the kind of digital health and health space from US VCs. So we did a health industry transaction with, two large US VCs just earlier this year. And then another in the AI space, in addition to the one I just mentioned, again, led by two US VCs. So, and I should just on the VC front probably give Builders a shout out as well, because they're part of, Mark Blackwell is the kind of person here on the ground along with the rest of the team. But Builders is ultimately a US venture fund, with a material presence here in Alberta, again, credit to Mark and to Christina at AEC.
So looking ahead, where do you see the tech scene in Alberta going? Whether there's challenges or opportunities, like where do we go from here as we're growing this ecosystem out? What do you see the next stage to be for Alberta and the technology market here?
Yeah. So I would say, the opportunities are really to continue to diversify the industries which Alberta is on the map for. I mean, like I said, I think that the common perspective is that, the Alberta tech company is, an energy transition company. And while there are certainly a lot of those and excellent companies doing work here in this province that, are really putting the province on the map, there's this, again, growth of just like founder talent across the board, quality of company across the board, where Alberta's, not just like an energy or ag destination, it's, an AI destination, a fintech destination, a digital and, digital health destination, life sciences, et cetera, destination. And I think the opportunity is really to continue to grow that, to make sure that this is like a super diverse ecosystem that just kind of really continues to breed awesome talent that will then again kind of reinvest in this ecosystem to continue to keep that flywheel spinning. So I think that's really the big opportunity, is the flywheel is spinning now. We've talked about in this episode that there's, so much infrastructure now that exists in the ecosystem, a lot of excitement. There's this really interesting kind of psychology of success that I think is also in like full swing, where, people are feeling excited about the opportunities that are there. They're seeing the wins, and it's just kind of making people double down and, reinvest in their own efforts in the ecosystem. And so, that opportunity is really to continue to grow this thing and, to make it the, Silicon Valley of the North, really. So I think that's the opportunity. And, certainly when I think about, what I want for the ecosystem, that's exactly what it is. And then I would say the challenges, to me, the two key challenges are talent is one for sure. We need to continue to develop and invest in talent, and, organizations, like SAIT and Rogers are, really looking at initiatives to solve that, as are, a number of other folks here in the ecosystem. And, we talked about a lot of the education that goes on in the ecosystem and how existing actors are trying to help new entrants into the space. The reality is, it's not, folks coming from the energy sector are brilliant, but the reality is you don't just, in some cases at least, go from being an engineer in oil and gas to tech the next day. And for many people, that's a bit of a journey. And so I think it's making sure we figure out and are supportive of that journey and helping people by giving them the resources and, sometimes the breathing room to actually make that transition. I read such an interesting article about a woman who had 3 children, was going to school, to, learn to write code and working. And it's, I think about if I was in that position, I'm like, that has to be just a monumental lift. And so, thinking about how we support everyone in our ecosystem and make sure that they're able to take part in this building exercise that we're in is important. The most important thing that I see, though, a challenge and what we really need is material exits at some point in this ecosystem. So, the valuation increases that we're seeing for a lot of the kind of leading companies and a lot of the momentum we're seeing for the early stage companies that are kind of really making waves in the ecosystem is important. And it's something we should be celebrating and that we should be very proud of as a province. But at some point, investors are going to be saying, we'd like to actually see the cash return versus the number on, the piece of paper growing. And that'll come with time. And there are, a number of companies that are getting to that point. And so it will happen. But I think that that's kind of one of the key catalysts for what I see as kind of the next phase of growth in this ecosystem is, there's been a ton of investment to get us to this point. And I think at some point people are going to say, we need to see, we want to see the return on that investment. And return on investment is, cash return to investors. It's, organizations who are supporting the growth of the sector, seeing the fruits of that labor in the sense that, we've shepherded this company from early stage to exit. And, those people are all now doing their own thing. There's lots of ways that people want to see those returns, but I think, starting to see some exits is going to be an important factor of the next phase.
Well, and it just becomes a compounding effect, right?
Yep.
Like I think about the earlier years in Silicon Valley,
Yep.
right? If you think about the early investors in Hewlett Packard, early investors
Yep.
into Google,
Yep.
and then those founders, they get rewarded,
Yep.
and then that just builds like 10 new funds,
Yep.
and then you get all this reinvestment back into the community, you
Yep.
get all this new innovation. So yeah, I think you're bang on that. That's that next stage. So once you see some exits, we start creating some wealth in the tech space
Absolutely.
directly from these returns.
Yep.
Then that's just going to compound the growth of that.
Yeah. I mean, like you need that, like, middle of the range developer at a company to just be getting a wild payout on their options.
Yeah.
Being able to take 2 years off to build something and realizing they don't have to go back to work because the company was just taking off and generating revenue. So like that's kind of that's where eventually this all needs to go, and it will get there. Like I guarantee you that. It's just it's a matter of time. The Alberta ecosystem has all the ingredients that it needs to make that happen and to just knock this out of the park. It's got the talent, it's got the work ethic, it's got the tight-knit community that wants to support and believes in that kind of rising tides philosophy. And it's got the interest of investors, which is most important both within Canada and abroad.
Michael, thank you so much for taking time to be on this podcast. Now, we're introducing something new for this new season of our podcast, so I haven't prepared you for this.
Ooh, okay, let's see.
And so you're going to be our first one to try this. And I want to end with, I'm going to end with a question here, and I want to get your gut response on it. But our podcast is all about having conversations, having communications. And so one of the things I want to ask you is, if you had an opportunity to interview or have a conversation with someone, anyone in the world, that you could be someone, from the past or, someone currently. Who would that person be and why?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. Okay. So, I've always been really kind of taken by and appreciative of the former President Barack Obama. So I would probably go with that. He strikes me as like a highly strong EQ type of person, who's great at kind of building consensus and community. And I think, as I kind of think about my own experience and translate that into what I see in Alberta, community is such an important thing. So, I'd probably say Obama. I think he'd be an interesting one.
Absolutely. I agree with you on that.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Awesome. Michael, thank you so much. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us on this podcast. There's a lot of topics. I definitely want to have you back on the podcast. There's a lot that we can dive into.
I'd love that. Look forward to the next one, Chris. Have a great day.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of This Professional Life. Don't forget to hit the follow button on whatever podcast platform you are listening to, and make sure to leave a review or comment about the podcast. Let me know what you think about the tech scene in Alberta, and is Alberta going to be the Silicon Valley of the North? Take care. I will catch you in the next episode.